Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. I'm your host, Yaakov Katz. Few American diplomats understand Israel's strategic landscape the way Ambassador Dan Shapiro does. As President Obama's ambassador to Israel from 2011 to 2017, he navigated the strained but essential relationship between Benjamin Netanyahu and a U.S. president, experience that offers important insight into the tensions we're seeing again today, this time between Netanyahu and President Donald Trump over the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. In recent years, Dan returned to government under President Biden, where he worked on expanding normalization across the Middle East, efforts that were underway before October 7th and were frozen in the aftermath of Hamas's massacre. He later moved to the Pentagon and helped shape the regional defense alignment that brought Israel, U.S., and other Arab countries together to intercept Iran's missile and drone barrages that were launched towards this country in April and October of 2024. In today's episode, I talked to Dan, who today is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, about the war in Gaza and whether the current ceasefire, very tenuous, can hold. What does a credible transition to phase 2 look like, and how do we get the other 19 points in the Trump 20-point plan implemented? But also, how can Israel, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia maybe still find a path forward to normalization in the shadow of one of the region's most devastating conflicts? I think you'll want to hear what Dan Shapiro has to say about all of these different issues. Stay with us. Ambassador Daniel Shapiro, it's great to have you on the JPPI podcast, and I really want to thank you for taking out the time to talk to me. I mean, there's a lot to kind of dig into here, and as we kind of watch, as things have developed over the last few weeks since the rollout of the 20-point Trump plan, what we're seeing so far, and, you know, I don't want to be the guy who rains on the party, but it seems almost that we're looking at one point of the plan that has been implemented, and maybe not fully that one point, with the deceased hostages, some of the bodies still being held in Gaza. I'm curious, when you look at the plan, there's obviously lots of holes and lots of potential pitfalls, but I'm curious what your analysis is, how you're looking at it, and what we should expect in terms of potential optimism of moving to the next stages of what this is supposed to have.
First of all, Yaakov, thanks for having me. Great to be on your podcast. Let me just back up to say that full credit is due to President Trump and his team for the really significant accomplishment of getting the ceasefire and the hostage release deal when they did. There's a lot of background, and we don't have to go through all of it. But the moment after the Israeli strike on Hamas leaders in Doha, they really saw an opportunity, an inflection point to use leverage effectively. Leverage with Israel, of course, which the president probably always had, given his relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu, but also to leverage others like Qatar and Turkey and Egypt to use their influence with Hamas to get, in the end, both sides to agree to terms that they had previously always rejected. Israel agreed to end the fighting without Hamas's disarmament or certainty of its being removed from power. Hamas agreed to release all the hostages without Israel withdrawing fully from Gaza or certainty the war wouldn't resume. Of course, as you said, they've released all the living hostages on the day of the Trump visit. And then I think we're at about 8 remaining deceased hostages they have not released yet. And that's obviously important to see that all the way through. But that's really, really important. And, you know, I think one of the truths about wars in the Middle East, and this one among them, are that they tend to end messy. It's not like there's frequently a clear victory or a clear surrender, and one side gets exactly everything they want. And of course, you know, the prime minister had talked about total victory and promised that. Well, that's not exactly where we are. And of course, Hamas has also been badly damaged. But in the end, because of that exhaustion, because of the moment when other parties, the United States and various other regional parties had leverage and used it, in the end, we ended up in kind of this sort of messy phase 1 of a 20-point plan. Now, phase 1 is important. I want to, again, underscore its importance. But to your real question, phase 2 is sort of where we're trying to get to get toward implementation. And just before I kind of analyze that, I will just say that I want to take you back. When I was on October 7th, I was working in the State Department as the essentially the special envoy to promote regional integration. We were trying to build out a bigger negative forum. We were trying to get the Saudis to normalize. We were working on more Abraham Accord countries, and many things were actually moving pretty well. In the end, obviously, after October 7th, a lot of that work had to be sort of paused, and later I went to the Pentagon. But the very first thing that happened as my portfolio was kind of put on the shelf was I was asked to do some work on post-conflict planning, day after planning, and got to work with a small team about that. And one of the first sort of planning assumptions I insisted we establish was that unless Hamas is really defeated, unless they're really removed from power, disarmed, no longer posing a threat, ruling Gaza or posing a threat from Gaza, we don't really have a day after. We don't get to a day after because all of the things that we want to see take place in that day after, a reconstruction of Gaza for Palestinians who want to live peacefully alongside Israel, international forces to provide some stability, some role for the PA or other moderate Palestinians to start to govern Gaza under international supervision, or even Israeli-Palestinian dialogue on a political horizon. All of that's not going to happen if Hamas clings to power. If no Israeli leader, certainly at that time in the fall of 2023, would have had the legitimacy to say to the Israeli public, after what Hamas did to us on October 7th, the worst attack against the Jewish people since the Holocaust, this round is going to end like all the other previous Gaza rounds, with Hamas battered and bruised, but clinging to power and holding on to arms and gradually rebuilding to prepare for another round. That was unacceptable as an outcome. In a way, it's still unacceptable as an outcome. But that's sort of where we are in this phase one. They amazingly have managed to hang on to power or control in 47% of Gaza. They are using their weapons to persecute Gazans, Palestinians who have challenged their rule. They are resisting any plan for disarming and therefore allowing a really different authority to take hold in Gaza. And that, I think, is sort of where we are. The disarmament piece is the key that unlocks everything else in phase two. That's a necessary prerequisite to reconstruction. Otherwise, Arab states are not going to make that investment if they're worried the next war will just destroy everything they build. The International Stabilization Force won't come in to fight Hamas and remove their weapons by force. The PA can't get a foothold. So all of those things are at stake in getting right the disarmament piece. We can talk a little bit about how that might happen, but that's, I think, where we are as of today.
So I mean, a couple of questions on this. One is, I look back at the plan that former Secretary of State Blinken kind of rolled out back in January of this year, just as the transition was taking place and shortly before leaving office. And this plan was already in the works for a while back when you were still in the administration. The 20-point plan is not dramatically different, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, there's details here that some of them make a big difference. For example, Donald Trump, it seems that maybe he got more buy-in from additional Arab countries that might have been at the time under Biden, although maybe Biden didn't make that as big an effort. Unclear if Israel would have had to withdraw completely, would have been able to retain some part of Gaza or control as it is now in this so-called yellow line. And would the hostages have been released in one go or in a phased withdrawal? But I'm looking more at the contours, the parameters of this plan. Very similar, right? There's nothing
Quite
here
similar.
that kind of, yeah. So why didn't this happen earlier then?
Well, I mean, part of the answer to that goes to that question of exhaustion and time, right? Like as of the summer of 2024, let's say when President Biden laid out at the end of May, his proposal for a two-phased hostage release deal, ceasefire hostage release deal, et cetera. And then negotiations ensued on that. There were things Hamas did not agree to, of course, about that plan in terms of releasing all the hostages or promising to do so. And most people assumed that they wanted ultimately to hold on to a certain number at the end for leverage. There were things the Prime Minister Netanyahu sort of added. The Philadelphia corridor was a kind of a new requirement that he placed in the summer of 2024. Then you get to sort of by the fall of 2024, and the natural thing everybody does in the weeks leading up to a U.S. Election is pause and wait and see. Right. And see what's going to happen and see who wins and see if your bargaining position improves. So we probably had some weeks and months where there wasn't that kind of appetite on either side to actually see this all the way through. I'm not in the camp of those who say everything the Biden administration did was correct or right, or we couldn't have done better. Of course, there were mistakes made, things we could have done better, although I think the broad policy was correct. But I do think that, there were things that were unique political factors now that didn't exist then. The prime minister, Netanyahu, has really defined his political identity in a critical moment for his own future by tying himself to Trump, to a point where he really can't say no to Trump. If Trump says, we're doing this now, I don't really see any way Netanyahu could resist that or would resist that. Whereas, as we've seen with multiple other presidents he has served with, he has found he can gain some political advantage by showing himself to be in some sort
and
of.
who but you knows this very well on his own flesh.
I know the story very well. The other thing, of course, Trump faced is no domestic political pushback, right? He has done he's used that leverage, and he's done it publicly, called for a ceasefire twice, once in the end of the 12-day war with Iran, once at a certain point in Gaza, publicly on social media, authorized his officials to have direct talks with Hamas, with a foreign terrorist organization. He had publicly said that he would not permit Israel to annex the West Bank because he promised the Arab states. I mean, these are interesting choices and tactics. And again, it's not criticism to say that had another president done those things, there would have been some strong domestic political pushback
Dan,
from the Republicans.
I don't want to interrupt, but and this kind of takes us in a different direction, but I do want to ask you this question because you're bringing this up. Why is it, and I totally agree with you, and I've written this and I've said this before, Netanyahu can fight with Obama, he can fight with Biden, and he gains points. He fights with Trump, he's going to lose points politically. It's also, if he fights with Trump, he doesn't know what he's going to get. I mean, but with Biden and Obama, maybe he kind of always thought that he knows the rules of the game. They're not going to do anything crazy outlandish. I mean, how do you explain that he's willing to go and really, do things with Obama and with President Biden that he would never do with Donald Trump? Why is that?
Well, again, I think that goes to this the difference on the domestic side in the U.S., that there were political forces that he could align with or rally or work with to generate pressure on a Democratic president, certainly probably most of the Republican Party, and even parts of the Democratic coalition as well. Now, you can say, a critic of the Biden administration, maybe from my left, would say, well, that doesn't matter. He should do X, Y, or Z anyway. But these are just facts that political leaders have to deal with when they're getting pushback, and how it can affect other aspects of the agenda, how it can take over the political debate they're trying to conduct on something else. So the prime minister is fully aware that with other presidents, he could align with those forces to put some counter pressures on another president. And that doesn't exist in the Trump phase. No Republican will criticize Trump about almost anything. It's really quite amazing, things that they would, go, I think, very, very strongly against another president. And most Democrats, of course, want the war to end. So they're, in a sense, they're encouraging, Trump to continue what he's been doing since that Doha strike. So that's why, to say, why didn't Biden do what Trump did, I think it's just not comparing apples to apples in the same political situation. Again, that's not to say there were things Biden couldn't have done or maybe should have done that are different than what he did do, and maybe could have produced different results. I can't say, but it isn't an apples to apples comparison in terms of the politics in either country once Trump is in office.
By the way, it kind of goes both ways, because while Netanyahu can attack Obama and Biden and can defy them in a different way that he can do to Trump. And we keep on hearing more about how Trump had to twist Netanyahu's arm into taking this deal. It came out just more in the 60 Minutes interview he gave over the weekend. But we also know that in Israel, if it was Naftali Bennett or Yair Lapid who sat in the president's in the Oval Office and made that phone call to the Prime Minister of Qatar and apologized, wow, what Bibi would do to that guy here in the Israeli political environment. But I want to take you back to what we were talking about, disarmament. Obviously, really complicated, right? And Hamas, we're seeing them reasserting themselves on the streets. We're seeing them taking control again, masked men, green headbands, AK-47s, executing people in broad daylight, fighting with the clans that they believe had collaborated with Israel. And this isn't to mention, let's even say someone can collect the weapons or leave them with their light arms. What do you do about the tunnels, right? The Israeli defense minister just said the other day, maybe Israel's destroyed 50%, 40%, I think he even said. So we're looking at another 150, 200 miles of tunnels that are still left in Gaza that have not been touched. I would think that's part of disarmament. Who is going to do all this? And what country in their right mind is going to deploy in Gaza when they know that none of this has been done?
I don't think anyone's going to deploy in Gaza while the current situation persists. So, the ongoing effort to recruit countries to participate in an international stabilization force, again, something we were working on in the Biden administration. And I personally, from the Pentagon, spoke to a number of these countries. Most of them said things along the lines of, first of all, we want to go in if it's under some sort of U.S. leadership role, not necessarily U.S. boots on the ground, but certainly U.S. leadership of this force. Second, we don't want to fight Hamas. We don't want to have to actually conduct operations against them or get caught in the crossfire between the IDF and Hamas. We want to go in when things have stabilized. So I think that's an existing and fairly long-standing now condition that most of these countries are setting: Indonesia, Azerbaijan, Egypt, UAE, Morocco, others. Now, so then how do we do it, right? Like, I don't think that first of all, the IDF, the one option is the IDF goes back in, right, into the 47% of Gaza that Hamas controls. I don't think President Trump wants that. That sort of, brings a collapse to this, what he calls end of the war. He even calls it Middle East peace, everlasting. He calls it some things that probably it's not under the best of circumstances. After 3,000 years, exactly. So, but, to have a quick return to, major fighting and all the casualties that will produce, thankfully, it wouldn't produce hostage casualties, but civilian casualties, soldier casualties, more isolation for Israel, maybe Israel getting stuck in an occupation of Gaza, and probably putting a kibosh on new normalization agreements. That doesn't really fit with Trump's plan. So that's not a very good option. None of these other troops want to come, but countries want to come in and fight. To me, I look at what was the tool that President Trump used once the Doha strike happened, and once the Gulf countries came to him and said, "Hey, this is really, something we do not want to see, and you don't want to see. You don't want to see the war come to the Gulf." He was able to tell them, look, if you want this war to end, we will, do some pressure on Netanyahu, but you need to generate pressure on Hamas, you Qatar and you Turkey. Frankly, I think bringing Turkey into the story was hugely important and something done more and better than we had done in the Biden years, because I think in many ways, Erdogan is in some ways more influential with Hamas than even Qatar is. He's an ideological fellow traveler. He's a Muslim Brotherhood figure. Qatar provides political support, some housing and some financial support, but the ideological support is more from Turkey. Those two countries leaning on Hamas leadership got them to agree to release all those hostages, something they had previously not agreed to do. I think President Trump needs to do the same thing to motivate those parties with that kind of influence on Hamas to pressure them to do the other things that are in the 20-point plan, to disarm, to leave. There's provisions for safe passage or exile. Frankly, that is something else I had been advocating in my time in government, that we use a model that we know from 1982 when 14,000 PLO cadres were sent into exile from Beirut to places around the Middle East at some distance from Israel. So there's ways this can be done if those countries will provide that leadership, that pressure, and then some facilitation, financing, et cetera, to implement it, to get the critical mass of Hamas fighters to lay down their arms and depart. And then you can talk about bringing in some kind of contractors or, some appropriate parties to do the physical work of decommissioning tunnels and that kind of thing. But I think the first exercise that needs to take place is the use of the leverage that those countries had that used it to get the hostage release, to do the same thing to get Hamas to agree to disarmament. Is it going to work? Is it easy? I don't know. Obviously, it's Hamas essentially giving up what they wanted more than anything, which was to show that they could climb out of the rubble after the war and say, we're still here, we survived, we're in power, we're ready for another round. But they are the best tool, I think, available to try to actually achieve that. And that is the key that underlies everything else we want to do in phase two. Without it, I'm not sure much of anything in phase two advances.
So disarmament, if I understand you correctly, is the main impediment at the moment, or is the step that is required, is essential for anything else to happen. And we have to rely, very interestingly, on these other countries to put the pressure on Hamas. But what I wonder, though, is longer this takes, the war is declared over. Israel withdraws to the so-called yellow line. Hamas is literally back in control of the 47%. If this vacuum is not filled quickly, right, if this doesn't happen soon, do we not find ourselves in a situation that it might just be impossible because Hamas will have reestablish that sovereignty, reestablish that control. And even if it's only 47%, they know that Trump doesn't want Israel going back in, and maybe they're going to be immune to some extent. And maybe this new reality, 53% Israel, 47% them, these new skirmishes along the so-called yellow line, whatever it is, I mean, that's going to become the new reality.
Yes, you're correct that there's reason for the concern that we might find ourselves there, and time is somewhat of the essence in that regard. I mean, I am concerned that we could end up in that sort of stasis or drift or kind of low-grade conflict you've described. And in that situation, there's not going to be any significant recovery or reconstruction. Obviously, there will be a lot of humanitarian suffering, not at maybe the same degree when war was ongoing, but it will continue to attract attention. And in many ways, the seeds will be sown for the next round of conflict. So I think this is critical, and I think it's timely. Now, some people have said, well, what if you, as a way of generating pressure on Hamas, allowed a reconstruction in the 53% of Gaza that the IDF controls? Sometimes this is being called New Gaza. I'm pretty dubious. I'm pretty dubious that Arab states will agree to major investment in reconstruction in areas under Israeli control. They would say Israeli occupation. I'm also dubious that any significant number of Palestinians would want to move into that part of Gaza and live under Israeli control. So that's not, I don't think, a very realistic alternative. Look, the U.S. role here is critical. The CENTCOM has set up this civil military coordination center to monitor the ceasefire by both sides, to facilitate aid delivery, to support the International Stabilization Force and maybe some Palestinian forces when they're ready to deploy. But none of that moves until Hamas disarmament occurs. And so I think and hope that is the primary focus. You've got to be doing all that other work in the background to get ready for the second part of phase two. But the first part of phase two is disarmament. And if you don't achieve it, you don't get to the rest of it. So you've got to go to the parties that have some influence with Hamas to convince them to do this. President Trump also used some of his, patented transactional style with Qatar and Turkey. What did Qatar get? They got a security guarantee in an executive order right before the agreement was announced. Turkey got at least a soft commitment to an F-35 program, something that's been stuck, and maybe a suspension of an investigation of a Turkish bank that's been involved in terrorist financing. So he's already in the souk, as it were, with the Emir of Qatar and with Erdogan. And if it takes, more goodies and more deals to get them to use that influence to get Hamas disarmed and removed from power, that may be necessary.
And he knows how to do that. I want to ask you a question, and I want to get to normalization in a moment because you were deep into that before October 7th. So I want to go there. But before that, one of the things that happened after October 7th was there was a push by the Biden administration to, there were different words that were thrown around about, they were calling it like the RPA, the Revitalized Palestinian Authority, the Reformed Palestinian Authority, whatever our word you want to choose. And Israel, of course, was against it, said, we're not letting the Palestinian Authority into Gaza. We look at the Trump plan. Of course, Palestinian Authority is part of that. And even a Palestinian state eventually is envisioned in the Trump plan. But I wonder, something I can't shake is this feeling of what would have happened, what would, one of these would have, could haves, had we taken the last 2 years and worked to reform and revitalize the Palestinian Authority. And is that not a big missed opportunity? I know that the people on the right will hear me say that and say, you're naive and foolish, and the Palestinian Authority can never revitalize and can never reform and will always incite and the pay for slay, all that stuff. But maybe there was a unique opportunity here that we missed. And now we're starting maybe to work on it together with the Trump administration, but we could have gotten a lot done over the last 2 years. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree that not anywhere near enough has been done in that regard. I think nothing has been done. I think there at least has been some serious thinking about it, and there are, credible Palestinians who have been engaged in describing what that revitalized or reformed Palestinian Authority might look like. But clearly, much of it hasn't been done. It's very difficult to do while President Abbas continues to be the leader of the Palestinian Authority. He, I think, is sort of past the moment of his political career where he's going to really be an active reform agent. I think frankly, several of there was a lot of division actually among Arab states that we encountered over which Palestinian leaders they wanted to invest in, whether they would invest in supporting a reform effort before Abbas left or until there was a different Palestinian prime minister, Palestinian Authority prime minister who they had more confidence in than the current leadership. So that was kind of a barrier to progress. It may still be to some degree. Look, it didn't help. I can't say this is the sole problem, but it didn't help that the Israeli government's position, at least Prime Minister Netanyahu's position, was we're not discussing any day after that arrangements in Gaza that involve any Palestinian Authority presence in Gaza. That may have been because that's what he believes. It may have been because he didn't have the political space to do that with Ben-Gvir and Smotrich in the cabinet, and they would have resigned if he discussed it. It may be because it would put on the table the idea of a Palestinian state at some point, or a West Bank and Gaza, kind of fused Palestinian entity. That's on the table now, of course, with Trump. It says the 20-point plan talks about a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. So that didn't help either, because then, Palestinian motivation is less, Arab motivation is less. What do you have to work with if the so what of it, or the where is this going? If you do succeed in some degree of reform of the Palestinian Authority, for Palestinians, they say, well, to achieve what? We're not coming back to Gaza. We're not getting a state. Why would we, go through those difficult efforts? So not enough happened. I agree. Not enough has happened in the first 9-10 months of the Trump administration either. This is a moment, right? An inflection point when there's a lot at stake in getting that right. Even now, of course, we don't hear from Israeli officials that they're open to Palestinian Authority presence in Gaza, even if reformed, even if revitalized, and so that continues to be a bit of a challenge. But I agree, it's necessary and should be high on the agenda of all parties who want this to succeed.
So moving to normalization, something you were working on a lot pre-October 7th, and there were reports at the time something might be moving on Indonesia, and then we saw right after Trump's visit to Israel and his speech before the Knesset and the ceasefire that there were these reports flying around that the president of Indonesia is going to be coming to Israel on the holiday of Simchat Torah. Apparently it was a bit premature. The president has not yet come, and we'll see if that does happen. But there was also obviously the Saudi plan and that normalization agreement that was deep into the weeds and the works and was moving through. There was the defense pact that was going to be brought to the Senate, was going to be one piece of that, and then there was the normalization agreement with Israel. When you look at where we are today, and let's say for an instance, everything we just spoke about for the last 25 minutes of the potential reasons why the second stage will not happen, although let's hope it does. Let's say it works and we get there. Can these normalization agreements happen? And can we be optimistic about it?
I think there's still a lot of opportunity and a lot of potential to continue to expand regional integration, which remains very much a U.S. interest, of course, an Israeli interest, I think an interest of all of these other regional partners of the United States as well. And it should be pursued and it should be prioritized. To some degree, it will be linked with whether we get some traction on implementation of the 20-point plan. I'm not saying 100%, but this story of the war in Gaza has dominated the Middle East coverage, what's on the TV screens of the publics in those countries for now 2 years. Without some pivot that says, okay, not the war didn't just end, and it seems to have ended, at least for now, but it's actually, moving into some better trajectory for the people of Gaza, for Israel's relations with Palestinians, for Israel's relations with its neighbors. I think it will be a burden on making as much progress as might otherwise be possible. Why is there still a lot of potential, though? First of all, one of the real positive outcomes of these last terrible 2 years has been a significant weakening of Iran and the Iranian axis of proxy groups that it supports, mostly through Israeli military power, also U.S. military power, and they're on their back foot, and they're really not able to pose the same kinds of threats. They do pose threats, but not the same kinds of threats or the degree of threats that they have. So that's a huge opportunity for the alternative coalition of Israel and moderate Arab states and even states outside the region and all U.S. partners to seize on that change using the range of tools, including economic tools and diplomatic tools and people-to-people and energy and tourism and all the other ways that cooperation can unfold. Interestingly, during the time at the Pentagon, this is now starting in January of 2024, so 3 months into the war until the end of the Biden administration, I was able to really see the way defense integration was continuing to progress in the defense sector. Right, that's how you get an April 13th coalition defense of Israel against the Iranian barrage of missiles. That's how we made progress on much of it not announced in terms of sharing of information and radar data and even face-to-face engagements between Israeli and Arab military leaders, even during this period of time. So there's a lot that is still happening even now that can be built on. In during middle of 2024, we were basically reached a point where we completed negotiations with Saudi Arabia on that defense treaty. We had a few final things to bring, but to the point where Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, came to Israel from Saudi Arabia after one of those negotiation sessions to say to the prime minister, I think this is ready. Once the war is over, once there's a ceasefire, we have a chance to move forward with that. Also still waiting to know what that Palestinian component of the normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia would be.
What, in your opinion, does Israel have to say to get the SAW? So let's assume everything else lines up. Now it hinges on the declaration by the Israeli prime minister. Does it have to be we embrace a two-state solution? Can it be we're committed to engaging in a political conversation or process? What is the language here that has to be declared by the Israelis for the Saudis to agree?
Look, Saudis are going to have to speak for themselves, and they've said various things through this period of time. They've talked about a meaningful Palestinian component. This was sort of before the war. They've talked about, since the war or during the war, a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. Toward the end of the Biden administration or during the transition, you started to hear much tougher versions of that, an actual establishment of a Palestinian state, something that sounds a lot more like the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 than the more recent language. Sometimes you'd hear from certain Saudi officials the hardline version, and then, in a private meeting, the Crown Prince, MBS, might say, I have some degree to be flexible on timing. I'm realistic. I'm not unrealistic about how fastly this will move. Look, we're all going to get a pretty clear sense of this on November 18th when the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman comes to the White House, meets with President Trump. It seems pretty likely there's going to be some discussion of some sort of U.S. security guarantee for Saudi Arabia. It won't be a treaty, but maybe something like what Qatar got in an executive order. But we'll hear that I don't think they're going to be ready to announce exactly what the Palestinian requirement is for Saudi Arabia for normalization, but we'll get a sense of what the Saudis are looking for there and how much they link it to how fast Gaza is improving and how much they link it to things even beyond Gaza in terms of that political horizon for Israelis and Palestinians. Look, I think in the short to medium term, probably we should keep our eyes on maybe some of the lower level efforts here to expand integration first before we go for the Hail Mary. That's the wrong metaphor, but the big the big kahuna, let's say, of Saudi Arabia. You could perhaps reconvene the Negev Forum and expand it. Get Jordan to sit at that table. Get Palestinians to sit at that table. Maybe the Indonesians, some of the African members of the Arab League. This was what we were building actually for a conference in October of 2023, which never happened. To come and say, look, this regional coalition is expanding and some are fully in, some are observers, but all those projects in energy, tourism, water, health, defense that we were discussing at the time, some of those can get off the ground. I could definitely imagine progress on Israel's relationship with Indonesia even before Saudi Arabia normalizes. But it might not start with full normalization. It might be some exchanges, some visits, some trade or tourism initiatives before you get to the full matter. And then, of course, you've got the possibility of a non-aggression agreement with Syria. It sounds like the president of Syria, Shara, is also coming to the White House. So some of these pieces might be able to advance on the board before you can get to the big, regional, massive reshaping that would be occasioned by Saudi normalization.
Can you give our viewers and listeners, if you don't mind, what is Indonesia's interest here? Like, we get the Arab countries, obviously they're massive Muslim countries, maybe the biggest. What's their interest in normalizing ties with Israel far away. We don't really have a war and no conflict with them. Never been an issue.
Yeah. Look, they're a moderate Muslim country. They're the largest by population Muslim country. The United States was, of course, under the Biden administration, actively working to build out its relations with its Asian Pacific or Indo-Pacific partners as part of a strategy to address the competition with China. And Indonesia was very much in the middle of that. And so there were trade benefits being discussed. There were different kinds of defense coordination opportunities that were being advanced. And, it was the kind of thing that the United States could put on the table and say, look, this matters to the United States. Indonesia has something to offer as a moderate Muslim country to help promote peace, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but even more broadly in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, broader Muslim world. And there was even discussion with the previous president of Indonesia, and he attended the G20 where the IMEC, the India Middle East Economic Corridor, was announced. This is September 2023, just weeks before October 7th. He was coming on a state visit to Washington in November of 23. I was in Jerusalem in September of 2023 with Indonesian officials and meeting with Israeli officials on the theory that we might be able to use his state visit as a way to make one of these announcements. Of course, October 7th, cut that completely short. But already by the summer of 2024, when the now president of Indonesia was then a candidate and the defense minister at the time, he was telling us voluntarily, Indonesia wants to participate in a post-war Gaza stabilization force. We see that that's a role Indonesia can play that contributes to this broader coalition of moderate countries across multiple regions, across multiple continents. So now, of course, Trump, again, being the transactionalist, I can certainly imagine in the proper timing and setting, he seems to have a good relationship with the Indonesian President Prabowo, that additional tariff reductions, other kinds of trade adjustments, maybe some kind of defense coordination can be part of what motivates Indonesia to take the step. They're saying, again, they're prepared to talk about putting 20,000 troops on the ground in Gaza. I'm not even sure the whole force needs to be 20,000 troops, much less the Indonesian component of it. But it shows a certain degree of enthusiasm that they see that they can improve their standing in the eyes of the United States as a regional and even extra-regional security partner. And I'm sure that links to their sense of the direction of their Arab partners in the region as well. At one time, I think it was really thought that first Saudi Arabia would normalize and only then would Indonesia do so. I think Indonesia knows that's the direction of travel. And so the sequence may be less important to them as long as they feel they're on sides with those partners as well.
I want to be cognizant of your time, and I do want to let you go, but I want to ask you one last question, just shifting gears for a moment. You mentioned what happened in April of 2024. And of course, what happened in October 2024, we saw the CENTCOM-led coalition. You were then in the Pentagon, now the Department of War, and overseeing Middle East policy and very much involved in helping to create that coalition and ensure that it came to Israel's defense at the time. We see now, so we saw that in April and October, and those first two exchanges of blows between Israel and Iran. We had a coalition of Arabs and Western forces, of course, helping Israel. We had the actual attack on Iran in June, the 12-day war, where the B-2 bombers were sent by the president and helped take out Fordo, Isfahan, and Natanz. And we see now CENTCOM in this civil military coordination center, boots on the ground in Kiryat Gat, inside Israel, not in Gaza, but a much more present U.S. military force or presence inside Israel. And I'm curious kind of your thoughts, because this is a dramatic change for Israel. And I know this could be a whole podcast in of itself, but I think you, and maybe I will have to have you back to talk about this at some point. But to me, it's a dramatic change because from a doctrine perspective or even a narrative perspective, Israel's story always was, we defend ourselves by ourselves, give us the means, give us the aid, give us the weapons, whether it was France back in the day and of course the United States over the last 50 years and more, maybe 60 already. That is somehow changing a bit. We can do a lot on our own, but we do need a lot of help. And we've seen that over the last 2 years. I mean, do you think there's a conceptual shift that might need to take place also here in Israel? And you know Israel really, really well. Do you think that needs to happen? Do you think it's happening? And do we fully understand maybe the consequences and impact of all of this?
I think it is a change. And I think many Israelis, at least in the sort of security establishment, do understand it. right? Israel's doctrine, of course, for most of its history was to try to fight short, intense wars with an overwhelming victory and then not have to be stretched in the way that a long war might stretch them. Well, of course, this last war over 2 years, which included dramatic Israeli accomplishments against many members of its axis of its enemies, Hamas, of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iran, the Houthis and other Iranian proxies as well, also cause enormous strain on Israel. We all know of the hundreds of days that various Israelis have had to serve in reserve duty, nearly 1,000 Israeli casualties in Gaza, and of course the strain on Israel, its economy and of course its international standing, but even the direct attacks from Iran. Now, the attack on April 2024 was of a certain dimension, and because we had really worked it in advance with Israel and with a number of other partners from the region and from out of the region, we were able to help ensure Israel was defended and endured just very minor damage. Same was true in the October attack. But the June war against Iran, which was something I thought was inevitable and necessary, that ultimately Iran was much too close for comfort to a nuclear weapon, both on the enrichment side and on the weaponization side, that if the negotiations didn't produce a deal, and it was pretty clear they would not, there was going to need to be military action, whether Israel or U.S. or both, as it turned out. But even in that war, Israel endured quite significant damage, less than was projected.
Right.
Hundreds of homes destroyed, or maybe thousands of homes destroyed, and hundreds of people wounded, about 20 or 30 people killed as well. And had it continued for some more time, it's not clear how long the air defenses would have held up. And even the air defenses that were used during that 12 years were dramatically supplemented by two U.S. THAAD batteries. Those had not been present in the April and October 2024 fights, but were present for that June 2025 fight, and were really, really necessary. So, I think it's a big question that Israeli military planners, strategic thinkers need to grapple with, right? How can Israel ensure that it is prepared and has the resources, the human resources, the bandwidth, the munitions, to sustain itself against the kinds of attacks its enemies are now capable of producing? And what's the U.S. role in helping defend that against that? What's even the regional role in helping defend that? That's one of the reasons why getting back on the road to a broader integration planning and execution is really important, because that has big implications for how countries help defend each other from common threats. And that does mean that this line that you cited of we defend ourselves by ourselves, it looks a little different. Israelis are resilient and brave and have defended themselves, and they deserve all the recognition for that. But it is clear that if the U.S. had not been in the fight, most especially in that June war with Iran, but even in those earlier encounters when building the coalition was so critical, that Israel, it could have survived it, but it would have endured much more damage. And you never know how a war like that proceeds, and then what the next turn of that wheel is. So being realistic, being thoughtful, being in close coordination with the U.S., even as the U.S. goes through its own kind of intense political debates about what its relationship with Israel should look like on both sides of the aisle, by the way, is really important. And just sort of repeating mantras that have been basically true and gotten us to this point in history, and assuming they're still going to be exactly true and don't require some rethinking, I don't think that's going to be sufficient.
Okay, well, Ambassador Dan Shapiro, I want to thank you so much for joining me. It's always great to get your insight and to hear what is, and hopefully what can still come down the road. So thank you so much for being with me.
Thanks, Yaakov. Thanks for everything you're doing, and great to talk.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode. As always, you can find us where podcasts can be found: Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and the website of the Times of Israel. Please do give us a 5-star rating. Please share this with your friends, your family, and anyone else who you think might be interested in hearing about what's happening here in Israel and the challenges of not only the state of Israel, but the Jewish world globally. We look forward to seeing you again in just a few days with another episode. But in the meantime, Have a great weekend. Shabbat Shalom to you all from here at JPPI in Jerusalem.